It began, as many of Moreau's cases did, with the rain. Not the clean, theatrical kind that drenches a street and then departs, but a fine, endless drizzle that seeps into the skin and the conscience alike. Along the embankments of the Seine, the lamps burned with a dull yellow hunger, their reflections trembling in the oily water below. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the clocks were striking 9 when a telegram arrived, unsigned, hurried, almost trembling, on the page. It claimed that a man who did not exist had been found dead in a small hotel room on Rue des Trois Frères. No papers, no wallet, no name. Only a half-burned letter, a photograph of a woman in a field, and a coat too fine for the room he had died in. Moreau read it twice, his pipe smoke curling like thought itself. Outside, the bells of Saint-Eustache tolled faintly in the fog. Somewhere in that sound, he felt the faint pulse of deceit. The city was breathing again, its 1,000 lives, its 1,000 lies, and in one of them lay the story of a man who had hidden his name too well. Before we follow Moreau into the lamplight and the shadows that will soon close around him, take a moment to join this journey. Subscribe, share, or simply stay with us through the fog. Each case he touches carries not only mystery, but the quiet pulse of what it means to be human beneath the weight of secrets. The telegram arrived just as the gaslights along the Quai des Orfèvres began their nightly struggle against the fog. It was a damp, colourless evening, the kind that made the Seine look like liquid slate, and the city seemed to breathe in slow, uneven sighs. Inspector Moreau stood by the open window of his office, watching the faint lights tremble across the river when the messenger entered, a boy with wet boots and the uneasy look of someone carrying bad news. The paper, once white, was already smudged with rain. Moreau took it, read it once, then again. The words were simple, hurried, written by someone who feared the ink might vanish before the message was sent. Unidentified man found dead. Stop small hotel, Rue des Trois Frères. Stop room locked from inside. Stop no papers. Stop request police. Inspector urgently. Stop no signature. No sender. That alone made it strange. The telegram had not come through official channels. Whoever sent it had bypassed the local commissariat and gone directly to headquarters. Moreau folded it carefully, slid it into his coat pocket, and reached for his hat. The air outside was heavy with the smell of rain and coal smoke. Carriages rattled along the cobblestones, their wheels whispering through puddles. He lit his pipe as he crossed the courtyard, the flame briefly illuminating his face, angular, thoughtful, marked by years of silence rather than speech. Behind him, the great building of the prefecture loomed, its walls soaked in stories no one ever wrote down. By the time he reached Montmartre, the drizzle had become a fine mist. It settled over everything. The awnings, the gas lamps, the shuttered bakeries, and the painted women who lingered beneath them. The Rue des Trois Frères was narrow, uneven, half asleep. A single constable waited outside the hotel, his oilskin cape shining faintly under the lamplight. "Inspector Moreau?" the young man asked, touching his cap. "The body's still upstairs. The doctor hasn't arrived yet." Moreau nodded. "Who found him?" "The landlady. She knocked this morning. No answer. She says she smelled gas. Broke the door around noon." "Any witnesses?" "None who'll talk, sir. But there's a man next door who says he heard something in the night. He's been drinking." Moreau's pipe smoke curled in the damp air as he studied the small facade of the building. The shutters above were drawn, the lace curtains dark with moisture. From somewhere nearby came the sound of a piano, half-tuned and half-forgotten. Paris never stopped playing its music, even for the dead. Inside, the hallway smelled of cabbage and kerosene. The wallpaper was peeling, its floral pattern drowning beneath years of neglect. The landlady, a thin woman in a shawl, met him at the stairs, wringing her hands as if the gesture might dry them. "It was awful, monsieur," she whispered. I opened the door, and he was just lying there, on the bed. So quiet, so pale. I thought he was asleep, but the window was shut tight, and I smelled the gas. He had turned the jet halfway open. "Suicide, then?" Moreau asked softly. She hesitated. "Perhaps. But he was dressed, monsieur, fully dressed. His coat, his shoes, even his hat on the chair. Who dresses himself for death?" The question lingered between them like a ghost. Moreau said nothing. He climbed the stairs, each step creaking under his weight. At the top, the constable unlocked the door to the room. It was small, barely large enough for a bed, a washstand, and a single chair. The air was still thick with gas, though the window now stood open to the rain. The body lay across the narrow mattress, one arm bent beneath him, the other resting loosely on his chest. He was middle-aged, perhaps 40, clean-shaven, with a faint scar near the jawline. His clothes were fine, too fine for such a place. A dark wool suit, polished shoes, and a silk tie that caught the lamplight, even in death. On the washstand stood a glass half filled with water, beside it a cheap alarm clock that had stopped at 3:22. The only items of note were a small leather wallet, empty, and a folded piece of paper that had been partially burned in the fireplace. Moreau bent to pick it up, careful not to disturb the ashes. The words were fragmented, but a few survived. "Forgive me. She will not know. My name." He straightened slowly. The sound of rain tapped against the sill, like faint, deliberate fingers. "Where is the rest of it?" he asked. The constable shook his head. "That's all we found, sir. No money, no identification, nothing in the pockets except this." He handed Moreau a small photograph. It was creased and water-stained, but the image was clear enough. A woman standing in a field, her hands clasped before her, the horizon stretching behind her in soft greys. Her eyes seemed to look directly at the camera, or beyond it. Moreau turned the photo over. No writing, no date. Only the faint impression of a photographer's stamp from a provincial town, Saint-Aubin-sur-Loire. The inspector slipped the photograph into his notebook. He studied the dead man once more, as though the answer might reveal itself through patience alone. There was no sign of struggle. The gas jet, turned halfway, could mean accident or intent. Yet something resisted the idea of suicide. The man's shoes were caked with dried mud, provincial mud, the kind found far beyond the city streets. He had arrived recently, perhaps yesterday, perhaps this morning, but why here, and why under no name at all? Moreau extinguished his pipe and leaned against the window frame. Below, the street shimmered beneath the lamplight. A stray dog passed, shaking rain from its fur, then vanished into an alley. Somewhere, a church bell struck 10. The doctor arrived at last, a small man with spectacles that fogged instantly in the warm air. He examined the body, muttering to himself. No wounds, no bruises. Gas poisoning, yes, but the lungs are not as congested as I would expect. I cannot be certain of the time. Perhaps 8, 10 hours? Moreau watched him quietly. Could the gas have been turned on after death? The doctor looked up. Possibly. But by whom? The inspector said nothing. He let his gaze wander once more to the bed, the chair, the empty wallet. Then he noticed something faint, an imprint on the table near the lamp. A ring had been placed there once and recently removed. The dust around it was lighter, the circle clean and distinct. A man who removes a ring does not always do so willingly. He turned to the constable. "Seal the room. No one enters until morning, and find out who sent that telegram." Outside, the rain had stopped, but the fog thickened. As Moreau stepped into the street, he felt the familiar weight of the city pressing in from all sides, the murmurs behind curtains, the quiet footsteps that ceased when he passed. He drew his coat tighter and began the slow walk back toward the river. Each case began the same way, a dead man, a few details, and the silence of those who had seen too much. Yet beneath it all there was always a pulse, faint, persistent, human. He paused beneath a gas lamp and looked once more at the photograph. The woman's face stared up at him, serene, almost alive in the flickering light. Whoever she was the key. A man does not hide his name without reason, and a woman does not appear in a photograph like that without knowing she will be found. A carriage passed, splashing water over the cobblestones. Moreau slipped the picture back into his coat and began to walk, his shadow stretching long across the wet street. Behind him, the faint light from the hotel window flickered, then went out completely. The city was silent again, save for the low whisper of the river and the echo of unseen footsteps that seemed to follow him until he reached the bridge. Somewhere, in that rhythm of water and stone, he thought he heard the first stirrings of what this case would become, a story of guilt, of love, and of a man who had hidden his name not from justice, but from himself. He drew one last breath of the fog-damp air and whispered, almost to the night itself, "Who were you?" The question drifted into the mist, unanswered. By morning, the fog had not lifted. It clung to the quays like a patient ghost, softening the edges of buildings and blurring the lines between river and sky. Inspector Moreau stood at the window of his apartment, the cup of black coffee in his hand, long gone cold. He had not slept. The photograph lay before him on the table, its corners curling slightly from the damp. The woman's face had kept him company through the night, serene, distant, caught forever in that field that seemed to stretch beyond time itself. The stamp on the back, Saint-Aubin-sur-Loire, was a modest clue, but enough. Moreau had traced cases on less. By 8, he was at the prefecture, his pipe lit, and his hat still damp from the rain. Lucas, one of his men, was waiting with a bundle of reports under his arm and an expression that suggested a long night of unanswered questions. "No name yet?" Moreau asked. "None, sir. We've checked missing persons from the last 2 weeks. Nothing close to the man's description, but there's something else. Someone called the local station last night asking whether a body had been found in Montmartre. Wouldn't give a name. Man or woman? Man. Nervous voice. Cut the line before we could trace it." Moreau nodded, thoughtful. "And the telegram?" "Filed at the Gare du Nord. No signature, no handwriting match. The clerk remembers only that it was sent by a gentleman in gloves." Moreau drew in the smoke, exhaled slowly. A man in gloves. A photograph from Saint-Aubin-sur-Loire. A corpse with no name and mud on his shoes. The pattern was forming, faint but discernible, like the outline of a drawing beneath fogged glass. He turned to Lucas. "Find a photographer's registry for Saint-Aubin, see if the name matches the stamp, and send a telegram ahead. I'll be taking the noon train." The ride south was long and quiet. The train clattered through the outskirts of Paris, where the factories stood like silent fortresses, and smoke rose from chimneys into the pale sky. Moreau sat by the window, the photograph resting in his gloved hand. He watched the fields slide by, wet and gleaming after the rain. He imagined the woman standing in one of them, the hem of her dress catching the breeze. Her eyes lifted, towards something beyond the frame. There was a sadness there, an absence of joy that struck him more deeply than beauty ever could. By the time the train reached Saint-Aubin, the sun was a pale coin behind the clouds. The town was small, its streets narrow and cobbled, the air carrying the smell of wet earth and wood smoke. At the corner cafe, men sat over Pernod and newspapers, their voices low. They looked up briefly when Moreau entered, then returned to their quiet rituals. He ordered coffee and asked the waiter, "Where might I find the photographer in town?" The man frowned, wiping his hands on his apron. "That would be Monsieur Delacour, down the Rue des Tilleuls. But he's been ill these months. His daughter runs the shop now." The photographer's shop was small, the windows clouded with dust and time. Inside, the scent of old chemicals mingled with lavender polish. Behind the counter, a young woman was sorting through glass plates, her fingers smudged with silver nitrate. She looked up as Moreau entered, her expression wary. "Are you Mademoiselle Delacour?" he asked. "Yes. How can I help you, monsieur?" He placed the photograph on the counter, face up. "Do you recognize this?" She leaned closer, squinting. "Yes, of course. That was taken last spring. Madame Lefebvre from the farm beyond the river. Her husband brought her here for a portrait, said it was her birthday. Do you remember his name?" "Lefebvre, I think. Henri Lefebvre. A quiet man. He came alone a few times after that for more prints. Paid in cash. Always polite, but strange somehow. Like someone who had more to say than he dared." "Do they still live here?" The girl hesitated. "Madame Lefebvre." "Yes. The husband, I heard he went away. There was talk of trouble, but in towns like this, there's always talk." Moreau thanked her and stepped back into the street. The church bell was striking noon, its echo rippling through the misty air. He followed the road that led out of the town, past the bridge and the narrow fields that mirrored the ones in the photograph. The Lefebvre farm was small but neat, a whitewashed house with blue shutters and a vegetable garden enclosed by a low stone wall. A woman stood by the doorway, hanging linen to dry. Even before she turned, Moreau recognized her. The same calm face, the same pale eyes, though now touched by fatigue and loss. "Madame Lefebvre?" She turned, startled, the clothespin still in her hand. "Yes." He introduced himself gently, removing his hat. "Inspector Moreau from Paris. I'm sorry to intrude. I'm here about your husband." Her hand faltered slightly, but she composed herself. "My husband? Has something happened to him?" "Perhaps. May I come in?" Inside, the air was warm with the scent of bread and iron from the stove. A child's toy lay forgotten by the chair. She poured coffee without being asked, her movements deliberate, as though each gesture helped her keep steady. "You said something may have happened," she said at last. "We found a man in Paris yesterday, no identification, but among his things was this." He placed the photograph on the table. Her breath caught. "That's mine." "Yes, it was found beside him." She sank into the chair, her fingers tightening on the edge of the tablecloth. "Then it's true. I thought perhaps he'd gone to his brother's in Tours. He didn't tell me he was leaving, only that he needed time. He'd been different these past months. Quiet. Nervous. I tried to ask, but he would only say it was work. He had work to finish." "Did he mention Paris?" "Only once. Said he hated it. Said the city swallows people whole." Moreau studied her face. There was no deceit in her eyes, only exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying too much grief in silence. "Did your husband ever speak of another name? A false one, perhaps?" She frowned slightly. "A false name? No. But once I found a letter on his desk, unsigned, half-written. It began, 'My dearest C.' I thought it was meant for me, but he tore it up when he saw I'd read it. I never asked again." The inspector's gaze drifted toward the window. Outside, the fields lay silent under the pale sky, and a crow sat on the fence, watching. Somewhere, far down the road, a train whistle sounded, faint, distant, inevitable. When Moreau left the house, he walked slowly toward the station. Each step seemed to echo with unspoken things. A man leaves his home, takes another name, writes letters he cannot send, dies alone in a hotel room. It was a pattern of shame, or love, or both. As he boarded the train back to Paris, he turned the photograph over once more. The faint stamp of Saint-Aubin-sur-Loire seemed to pulse against his fingers. Beneath it, he thought he could see another mark, faint and almost erased, the edge of a thumbprint, smudged but unmistakable. That night, back in his apartment, Moreau laid the photograph beside the burned letter fragment. The words seemed to answer one another across the table. "She will not know my name," My dearest C. He leaned back, the city whispering through the open window. The bells tolled 11. The river sighed against its banks, and Moreau understood that the case was no longer about a dead man. It was about the woman who had lived and what she might be forced to remember. Somewhere, he thought, a letter had gone missing, and if he found it, the dead man might finally have a name again. By the next morning, the fog had thinned into a grey mist that hovered low above the rooftops. The city was quieter than usual, as if even Paris hesitated to speak too loudly after what it had heard the night before. Inspector Moreau reached the Rue des Trois Frères just as the first cafes began to open, their doors releasing the scent of strong coffee and last night's tobacco. The little hotel stood in its usual indifference, a slanted sign, the shutters half closed, a few letters missing from its name. Life had resumed around it, yet the air near its entrance felt different, thickened by memory. Inside, the gaslight burned dimly. The corridor still smelled of old wallpaper, kerosene, and damp wood. Moreau found the landlady in her office, behind a desk too large for the room. She was a woman of about 50, with careful hair and the sharp, appraising eyes of someone who had learned to recognize trouble before it announced itself. "You again, monsieur?" she asked, though not unkindly. "Yes," Moreau replied, setting his hat on the counter. "I thought it better to return when the city was awake. Things looked different by daylight." She gave a small shrug. "Sometimes worse?" He smiled faintly. "Tell me about him again, the man in room 6. Start with when he arrived." She hesitated, then reached for her account book. 3 nights ago, no luggage, only a valise and a folded coat over his arm. Paid for 2 nights in advance. Said his name was Dubois. But I've known too many Dubois in my life, and none of them were real. Did he sign the register? Yes, but I burned the page. Moreau looked up sharply. You burned it? Her hands fluttered nervously over the book. I didn't mean to. The police were here all day, and the gas lamp tipped over last night. The edge of the page caught fire. You can still see a bit of it if you like. She opened the ledger. On the charred corner, a few letters remained. D. And then nothing but blackened ash. Strange accident, Moreau murmured. She met his gaze evenly. This house has known stranger things, monsieur. He studied her for a long moment. You said he seemed nervous. Yes, nervous, but not afraid. He would come in late, always after midnight, and stand at the window for hours. I could see the light from the street. Once I asked if he wanted supper, but he only smiled, said he wasn't hungry. Did he have visitors? The woman hesitated. There was one. The second night, a man, well dressed, arrived just before 11. I didn't see him leave. Describe him. Taller than the dead one, a foreign accent, maybe Belgian. Smoked those strong cigarettes that smell like cloves. I remember because he left the stub in the ashtray in the corridor. Moreau's attention sharpened. Do you still have it? She looked uncertain. The cleaning girl threw it away, I think. He said nothing, only nodded. The silence lengthened until she spoke again, softer this time. I heard voices that night, not shouting, low, like men arguing who don't want to be heard. Then footsteps. One of them left, but I never saw him pass the desk. The next morning, room 6 was quiet. I thought he'd gone until the smell started. Outside, a cart clattered past, its iron wheels striking sparks from the cobblestones. Moreau glanced toward the narrow staircase. May I see the room again? She hesitated. If you must. The room looked smaller in daylight, stripped of its mystery, but not of its tension. Dust motes swirled in the thin beam of light that came through the open window. The bed had been remade, yet the impression of the body still lingered in the creases of the coverlet. Moreau walked slowly around the room, his gloved hand brushing the edges of the washstand, the cold metal of the gas jet, the worn surface of the chair. He noticed something the police had missed, a faint scuff mark beneath the window where a shoe had dragged against the wall. Beside it, a trace of ash, too coarse for cigarette smoke, perhaps from a match struck in haste. Moreau knelt. In the corner, half hidden beneath the skirting board, was a small scrap of paper. He eased it out with his penknife. The fragment was from an envelope addressed to Monsieur H. Leff before the tear. The rest was gone, but it was enough. He slipped it into his notebook and stood. "You said you didn't see the second man leave. Are you certain?" The landlady folded her arms. "I'm not blind, Inspector. I sit by that door every night. No one left." "Then perhaps," Moreau said quietly, "he didn't use the door." She frowned. "The window? Impossible. We're on the second floor." "Not impossible, only inconvenient." He crossed to the window and leaned out. The rain had washed the ledge clean, but the drain pipe nearby showed the faint imprint of a hand. Someone had climbed down or up very recently. As he turned back, he caught sight of a shadow in the doorway. It was the constable from the night before, hat in hand, his face pale. "Inspector, there's a man downstairs asking for you. Says his name is Fournier. Claims he knows the dead man." Moreau followed him down the stairs. In the lobby, a figure waited by the door. A lean man with a dark coat and the kind of eyes that had seen too much. When he spoke, his voice carried both hesitation and practiced composure. "You are Inspector Moreau?" "I am. You knew the deceased?" The man glanced toward the staircase. "We worked together once, years ago, at a shipping office near Orléans. He was called Henri Lefebvre." Moreau's eyes narrowed. "You're certain?" "Quite. He left the company suddenly. There were rumors, money missing, a woman involved. I thought he'd gone abroad." "And you came here because you heard of his death?" Fournier shook his head. "Because of a letter. I received it yesterday. Postmarked Paris, but written in his hand. He asked me to destroy some papers, said it was a matter of honor. I came to find him, but it seems I'm too late. Do you have the letter?" The man reached into his coat and handed it over. The paper smelled faintly of tobacco and rain. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. "If anything should happen to me, see that the envelope marked C is burned. You will find it where we last met." No signature, but the same handwriting as the burned note in room 6. Moreau folded it carefully. "Where did you last meet?" Fournier hesitated. "At a café in Saint-Aubin, near the bridge." The inspector looked at him steadily. "Then I suggest you return there. But if you find that envelope, do not burn it. Bring it to me at once." Fournier nodded slowly. "You think he was murdered?" Moreau drew on his pipe. The smoke curled between them like a thought neither dared speak aloud. "I think," he said, "that men who die without names seldom die by accident." Outside, the bells of Montmartre began to toll the hour. The sound rolled over the rooftops and drifted down through the narrow streets. The fog was lifting at last, but the city beneath it looked no clearer. As Moreau stepped into the street, the photograph pressed against his chest like a heartbeat. Somewhere behind one of these shuttered windows, the story was still alive, waiting for the moment it would turn and look back at him. The morning after Fournier's visit, the first train from Paris to Orléans cut through the mist like a blade through milk. Inspector Moreau sat in a compartment alone, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels setting a slow, steady pulse beneath his thoughts. In the pocket of his coat rested the letter, folded twice, its edges worn by handling. He had read it many times since dawn, hoping the paper might whisper something new, but it remained stubbornly mute. A man's dying message to burn an envelope that could not be found. Outside, the countryside unrolled in long grey ribbons. Bare poplars lined the canals, their reflections trembling in the water. The air smelled faintly of frost and smoke. Somewhere beyond those fields lay Saint-Aubin, the quiet town that had already appeared twice in this story, once on the photograph, once in the letter. And between those two appearances, a life had been erased. When he arrived, the station was nearly empty. A woman in a dark shawl swept the platform. A child chased a wooden hoop near the gates. Life here moved at a pace untroubled by death or discovery. Moreau adjusted his collar against the cold and began the walk toward the bridge that spanned the Loire. He had been here before, years ago, on another case, one that had ended with a body found in the reeds. Towns like this never changed. They merely learned to forget. The cafe near the bridge still stood, though the sign had faded to a blur of letters and old paint. Inside, the warmth struck him immediately, along with the familiar murmur of provincial gossip. 3 men at the counter fell silent as he entered, their eyes sliding toward his coat, his hat, the inevitable air of Paris that clung to him. He greeted the innkeeper, a thick-set man with sleeves rolled high and a towel slung across his shoulder. "Coffee?" Moreau said. "Perhaps some conversation." The man smiled faintly. "Conversation costs extra, monsieur. Then I'll pay double." The innkeeper poured the coffee, black and steaming, then leaned against the counter. "You're not from here?" "No," Moreau said. "I'm looking for a man named Lefebvre. Henri Lefebvre." The smile faltered. "I knew him." "When did you last see him?" The man wiped a spot on the counter that didn't need wiping. "A month ago, maybe more. He came often. Sat in that corner by the stove, always writing letters, never posted them. Sometimes he'd ask me for an envelope, sometimes not. He was polite, quiet, paid on time. The kind you forget until you realize you've been trying to forget him." "Did anyone ever join him here?" The innkeeper nodded slowly. "Once or twice. A man from Paris, I think. Wore gloves even indoors. They spoke in low voices, and when they left, I found a torn envelope under the table, addressed to C. I thought it was nothing, so I threw it out." Moreau took out his pipe, but didn't light it. "And Madame Lefebvre? Does she come here?" "Once or twice, yes, after he disappeared. She asked if I'd seen him, and when I said no, she cried a little. Not much, just enough to show she'd already expected the answer." The inspector nodded, his mind weaving threads between words. Was Lefebvre afraid? The man hesitated. Not afraid exactly, but he looked hunted, as if someone had found him in his sleep and wouldn't let him wake. Moreau drank the last of his coffee, then rose. "Thank you. One last thing. Was there ever any talk of money missing from the shipping company?" The innkeeper's brows lifted slightly. "Ah, so that's it." "Yes, there were whispers. A sum gone missing, quietly covered, but no one ever proved anything. People said he left to spare his employer the scandal." Moreau nodded again. "Or himself." He stepped outside into the cold. The bridge arched over the slow-moving river, the water glinting like dull metal beneath the weak sun. He leaned against the railing, his breath misting in the air, and stared at the reflection of the town, the crooked roofs, the crooked lives. Somewhere, he thought, beneath that reflection, the truth was hiding. He took out the letter again, tracing the handwriting with his thumb. "If anything should happen to me, see that the envelope marked C is burned." But Fournier had not found it, or so he claimed. Perhaps it was still here, somewhere between the cafe and the river, waiting to be discovered by someone who knew where to look. Moreau followed the narrow road past the last houses to a small post office. The clerk, a thin man with spectacles and a suspicious manner, squinted at the inspector's credentials. "Henri Lefebvre," he repeated. "Yes, I remember the name. He came often, asked for letters that never arrived. Once he left one here, but it was returned a week later. Unclaimed. Do you still have it?" The clerk rummaged through a drawer, producing a bundle of uncollected envelopes bound with twine. He leafed through them slowly, muttering names until he stopped, Here, it's old, but this is his hand. Moreau took the envelope carefully. The address was simple: Madame C. Valenne, Rue de Turenne, Paris. The seal was unbroken. He slipped it into his coat, feeling the weight of it against his chest, a fragile heartbeat from the past, carried forward by accident. The inspector left the post office and walked back toward the station. The sky had begun to darken, the edges of the town fading into the grey of approaching rain. He stopped once, beneath the skeletal branches of a tree, and glanced again at the letter. The handwriting was steady, deliberate, like a man who wanted to appear calm, even as he trembled inside. At the station, a porter was sweeping the platform. Moreau asked, "Did a man named Lefebvre travel recently, perhaps in the last week?" The porter thought for a moment. "A man by that name, yes. Bought a ticket for Paris. Wore a dark coat, no luggage. I remember because he dropped something, a ring, I think. He didn't notice." "A ring?" "Yes, a plain band. I gave it to the ticket clerk." The clerk, a young woman with careful hair and ink-stained fingers, nodded when he asked. "Yes, monsieur, I remember. It was a gold ring with initials inside, HL and CV. I kept it here." She opened a drawer and produced the ring, still wrapped in tissue paper. Moreau held it in his palm. The gold was dull, but the engraving was clear. He turned it once, twice, then placed it gently back on the counter. "I'll take it," he said. "For the record." As the train back to Paris pulled from the station, he sat again by the window, the ring and the letter resting side by side on the seat. The countryside rolled past in shades of silver and grey. It was not difficult now to imagine the man sitting in the same seat days before, staring out at the same fields, his hand resting on the ring he would soon remove. When the lights of Paris finally appeared, faint and trembling through the haze, Moreau leaned back and closed his eyes. The case was no longer about how Henri Lefebvre had died. It was about why he had chosen to die without his name. And in that question, Moreau felt the stirrings of something uncomfortably close to understanding, because sometimes a man hides his name not to escape the world, but to protect someone in it. And sometimes even death is only the last disguise. The train whistled as it entered the city, echoing down the iron bridges and empty streets. Moreau opened his eyes, the photograph still vivid in his mind, the woman in the field, her calm gaze, the wind that would not stop moving her hair. She was waiting for him still. The carriage rattled through the narrow streets of Paris, the city already drowning in the evening's damp light. Inspector Moreau sat inside, the letter and the ring resting in his gloved hand. The city outside felt different, now heavier somehow, as if it too knew something had been uncovered that should have remained buried. Gas lamps flickered uncertainly, their glow broken by the restless fog that rose again from the river. Somewhere, a violin played behind closed shutters, a faint thread of beauty stretched over the noise of carts and rain. By the time the carriage stopped on the Rue de Turenne, darkness had settled completely. The street was quiet, save for the slow drip of water from a broken gutter. Number 46 stood at the end, its facade pale and symmetrical, a building that had once been elegant and now merely endured. Moreau dismissed the driver and stood for a moment beneath the awning, listening. A faint light shone behind one of the second-floor curtains. The shape of a woman moved there, still for a long moment, then gone. He climbed the steps and rang. The sound of his knock seemed to echo too loudly in the hallway beyond. After a pause, footsteps approached, measured, deliberate. When the door opened, a maid stood there, pale-faced, her eyes uncertain. "Madame Valenne," Moreau said quietly. "I am Inspector Moreau, of the police judiciaire." The woman hesitated, then nodded faintly. "Madame is unwell, monsieur. She does not receive visitors. Tell her this concerns a man named Henri Lefebvre." The maid froze, her lips parting slightly. She turned without a word and disappeared into the shadows of the hallway. A moment later, another voice came, soft, composed, touched by fatigue. "Let him in." Madame Valenne stood in the drawing-room beneath the glow of a single oil lamp. She was not as the photograph had suggested. There she had seemed ethereal, caught between youth and melancholy. Here she was very much alive, graceful, controlled, her dark dress perfectly arranged. Only her eyes betrayed something deeper, an old sorrow that had not entirely learned how to disguise itself. "Inspector," she said, gesturing toward the chair opposite hers. "I expected you sooner." Moreau inclined his head. "Then you knew I would come." She smiled faintly. When one receives a letter sealed with the prefecture's crest, one does not need to be clairvoyant. He sat. The silence that followed was long, but not empty. Outside, the rain began again, tapping softly against the window panes. "I believe you knew a man who called himself Henri Lefebvre," Moreau began. "Or perhaps he had another name when he was with you." Her eyes did not waver. "I knew him, once." "May I ask in what capacity?" "As one might know someone who changes the course of one's life, Inspector. Does that suffice?" Moreau studied her carefully. "He was found dead 3 nights ago in a Montmartre hotel. His death was ruled inconclusive. He had in his possession a photograph of you, taken in Saint-Aubin, and a letter addressed here." For the first time, something flickered across her face. Surprise, swiftly masked. "I see, and what is it you wish to know?" "Why he was there. Why he hid his name. And why he asked another man to destroy an envelope marked C." Her lips parted slightly, then closed again. She reached for the small silver box on the table, drew out a cigarette, and lit it with hands that did not quite tremble. The smoke curled between them like a veil. "Henri Lefebvre," she said softly, "was not a liar by nature, but the world makes liars of those who cannot afford truth. When we met, he was already running, from scandal, from debt, perhaps from himself. He told me he had left everything behind. I believed him. I wanted to believe him." Moreau leaned forward slightly. "And the letter?" "He wrote many," she said. "Most I never received. Some I returned, unopened. You see, Inspector, I am married. My husband is a lawyer, respected, and reputation is a fragile thing. Henri knew this. That was why he left Paris. But he wrote me once more, the last time. He said he was tired of pretending, that he had one confession left to make, and then nothing. Did he ever speak of another man, one who met him at the café in Saint-Aubin?" She exhaled slowly. "Yes. He called him Fournier, said they shared a past he regretted. There was money once, entrusted, then lost. Henri took the blame, though it was not his alone. I begged him to forget it, but men like him cannot forget. They need to make amends, even when no one is asking them to." Moreau opened his coat and withdrew the ring. It glinted in the lamplight, dull gold, initials engraved inside. H.L. and C.V. "He left this behind at the station," he said. Her hand trembled as she took it. "He wore it always. He said it was a promise, not of marriage, but of remembrance. I told him to destroy it. He refused." "And now?" She looked down at the ring for a long moment before closing her fingers around it. "Now it seems he finally did." The inspector watched her. "You said your husband is a lawyer. Does he know of this?" Her smile returned, faint and bitter. "He knows everything, Inspector. In such houses, silence is not ignorance, it is arrangement." He stood, slowly. "If you have any letters, anything he sent, I will need them." Her eyes met his. "And if I refuse?" "Then the press will not. They already whisper that a man died under a false name, perhaps for love, perhaps for shame." "You would do better to let me protect what remains." She regarded him for a long time, then rose and crossed to a small desk by the window. From its drawer, she withdrew an envelope tied with ribbon. "I kept only this," she said. "The last one he sent. I could never bring myself to read it." She handed it to him. The paper was thin, the handwriting unmistakable. On the back, faintly, the mark of a fingerprint smudged with soot. "Thank you," Moreau said. As he turned to leave, she spoke again, her voice softer now. "Inspector, when you read it, if it says anything cruel, remember this. He was a kind man once. The world is not kind to such men." Outside, the rain had turned heavier. Moreau paused under the awning, lighting his pipe with difficulty. He looked back at the window. The silhouette of Madame Valenne moved briefly behind the curtain, then vanished into shadow. He began to walk, the letter clutched tightly in his hand. The lamps along the Rue de Turenne hissed and flickered, throwing long, wavering shadows across the stones. Somewhere in the distance, a carriage passed, the wheels echoing like fading heartbeats. By the time Moreau reached the bridge near the Seine, the letter was already damp from the rain. He stopped beneath a lamp-post, shielding it from the wind, and carefully broke the seal. The paper unfolded like a confession waiting to breathe. The first line was written with a steadiness that spoke of despair more than courage. "To see, by the time you read this, my name will no longer matter." The rest of the words blurred in the rain, but one phrase remained clear, indelible even in the damp light. "It was not love that destroyed me. It was the price of having loved." Moreau folded the letter again, staring out over the dark river. Somewhere beyond its slow, unbroken surface, he felt the weight of the story settle, unfinished, unresolved. Behind one of those shuttered windows, the truth waited still, cloaked in the quiet of those who had survived it. He turned toward the Quai des Orfèvres, the fog rising again at his feet. The night carried him forward, and with it the whisper of a secret he had not yet learned to name. By dawn the city had acquired a voice, and it was printed in ink. The kiosks along the boulevards blossomed with damp pages, headlines squinting through the fog like exhausted sentries. Inspector Moreau crossed the Place du Châtelet as delivery boys shouted, their cries rising into the pale air. A nameless corpse in Montmartre, a photograph of a woman, whispers of a ring abandoned on a railway counter. Nothing in the papers was precise, but precision had never sold a single copy. It was suggestion that moved the city, suggestion and the old appetite for someone else's misfortune. At the prefecture, the corridors already smelled of wet wool and cheap coffee. Lucas stood waiting by Moreau's door, his cap tucked under one arm, his expression composed as always, but with that pinch between the brows that meant the news had arrived before the day. On the inspector's desk lay 3 morning editions, their ink still damp enough to smudge a careless thumb. On each, the same phrase leapt like a dare. "L'homme sans nom," the man without a name. "They're guessing at espionage," Lucas said, placing a telegram beside the pile. "Another sheet goes for blackmail. One says he was a foreign banker hiding debts." "None of them says he was a man," Moreau murmured, "who once loved." Lucas gave the faintest ghost of a smile. "That rarely prints." The telegram was from Orléans. Fournier had not found the envelope marked C at the café where he and Lefebvre had last met. Either it had never been there, or someone with quicker hands had reached first. Moreau studied the brief message until the letters blurred, then set it aside. Outside the window the river wore its habitual mask, wide, impassive, indifferent. The city mirrored it when convenient. Before the clock had struck 10, a clerk from the prefect's office rapped on the door and delivered the day's admonition with solicitous courtesy. "The prefect requests that you consider the political reverberations, Inspector. A case of this delicacy, names in society, the bar, the ministry, should be shepherded with a lighter touch." "Which means?" Moreau asked. "Which means discretion," the clerk said, lowering his voice although the corridor was empty. "And economy of truth. Newspapers must not learn what would embarrass those who are unaccustomed to embarrassment. Newspapers rarely learn anything else, Moreau said. He closed the door gently on the apology the young man had not found yet. By noon, the first rumour reached him formally, folded into the official tone of a deputy prosecutor, whose spectacles flashed like small swords. It suggested that the woman in the photograph might be known to persons of influence, that a lawyer, well regarded, had tolerated a period of indiscretion in his household. That discretion had now become an imperative guarded by more than mere pride. The words were careful, as if walking barefoot across a floor strewn with pins. "Am I to understand," Moreau asked, "that justice has mislaid its balance because a man owns 2 silk hats instead of 1? The deputy's smile was courteous and fixed, like a ribbon pinned to a lapel and forgotten. "I am to understand nothing at all, Inspector. I am merely to remind you that some truths can be preserved by silence and all scandals enlarged by curiosity." "Then we will try to be silent," Moreau said, "but not blind." He left the building and walked into a cold that felt cleaner than the air inside. He bought the afternoon edition from a boy whose fingertips shone black and blue with ink and frost. The paper carried an engraving of a door locked from within, a lamp burning beside a bed, a shadow leaning over a shape the reader was invited to recognize. The caption asked whether suicide could be the disguise of murder, or murder the disguise of shame. It mentioned a ring, initials omitted, and a letter that spoke of love without speaking any names. The anonymous writer had style and an appetite for caution, sharpened by daring. Moreau read to the end and recognized the hand that was not a hand at all, the newsroom habit of assembling fragments into a mask and calling it a face. He crossed to a cafe on the quay where reporters liked to warm their hands and reputations. The proprietor nodded wordlessly and set a glass on the table. It hissed a little as it met the wood, the sound of small comforts in a loud world. Before Moreau had lifted it, a man slid into the opposite chair without asking. He was thin, well-shaven, and wore a scarf that had seen too many evenings. His eyes were bright with education and fatigue. "Inspector," he said. "We haven't met, but you know me often enough. Béraud, La Sentinelle." "I read you this morning," Moreau said. "You made a locked door into a stage." "It asked to be a stage," Béraud replied. "So many tragedies do. I won't pretend to virtue. I came to ask for a word not yet printed." "There are only words already printed," Moreau said. "The ones you have, and the ones you will use if I refuse." "Not quite," Béraud said softly. "There's the word that spares a woman. Give me that one, and I'll accept a poorer headline." Moreau studied him. The cafe's windows held the river like a dark idea. A steamboat downshifted its breath. "You've seen the photograph?" "I've heard of it," Béraud said. He did not push the point. "I've also heard, pure rumour, that a gentleman of the courts is inclined to consider a libel suit before breakfast. Those suits are rarely about money." "They are about memory," Moreau said. "Certain men are determined to have only one." "A luxury I envy," Béraud said, smiling thinly. "Tell me only this. Was the nameless man what the street says he was, a blackmailer? I can write him rotten and save someone else." Moreau shook his head once. "Do not save anyone by inventing a sin he did not commit. It breeds 2 lies for every truth it hides." Béraud sat back, chastened or considering. With reporters it was the same face. "Then I will write him unfortunate. That sells fewer copies, but it lets me sleep. You'll hear worse from the noon sheets. One has a line about a foreign passport, entirely imagined. Another will say he was an anarchist because he died alone." "Let them," Moreau said. "I am searching for a different country." "Which?" "The one where a man uses a false name and tells a true story while doing it." Béraud's smile returned, not without warmth. "You'll forgive me if I borrow the sentence." When the journalist had gone, Moreau finished his glass and rose. The day was sharpening into evening. The lamps along the quay had begun their brittle song. He walked toward the morgue, where the public came to confirm or deny the dead, and where curiosity paid nothing at the door. The attendants knew him. They nodded and stepped aside with their professional quiet, as if death were a guest best left undisturbed by introductions. Henri Lefebvre lay among strangers, his anonymity now a kind of company. Moreau stood beside the slab and watched the face that had refused a name, training his attention on the ordinary details that newspapers overlooked. The line worn into the thumb where a ring had long rested, the faint abrasions on the wrist, as if a cuff had been gripped urgently, the residue beneath a nail that was not city grime at all, but a pale dust. Chalk, perhaps, from a wall or a walkway where one steadied himself before climbing. The drain pipe at the hotel had been no rumour. Someone had come and gone the way a thought escapes a mind, quick, quiet, unrecorded. He left as he had entered, without ceremony, and the cold met him like an argument he could respect. Along the quay he encountered Lucas again, hurrying with the determination of men who fear they are late to a truth that will not wait. "A message at the desk for you," Lucas said. "No signature. The clerk swears he didn't see the face." They turned into the first doorway, with enough shelter to read. The note was brief, written with a hand that denied its own personality. "Do not pursue the envelope marked C. It concerns only the living. The dead have relinquished their rights." Moreau folded it once. "The living are most dangerous when they speak for the dead." "We can trace the paper," Lucas offered. "We can," Moreau said, "but the paper will only confess to an ink seller on the Rue du Bac and a clerk with poor memory. Let us answer the letter differently." "How?" "By visiting the only person to whom it believes it owes no answer." "You mean Madame Valenne," Lucas said. "Her husband," Moreau replied. They walked in silence to the Marais, where the streets arranged themselves with sober memory, each façade certain of its past. The Valenne residence admitted them after a delay that served as a small lecture. In the study a fire burned like a well-groomed argument. The books stood with their backs aligned, a parade of discipline. Monsieur Valenne rose with the polite weariness of a man for whom receiving the police was an unmerited discourtesy. He was elegant without ostentation, his features discreetly lined by success. "Inspector," he said, "this is inconvenient." "Death tends to be," Moreau said. "May I trouble you with economy? I have read a letter from the deceased. I have also received another warning me to forget that letter existed. I dislike being instructed to forget." "A natural defect in your profession," Valenne said. He gestured to chairs, then chose not to sit. "What is it you want?" "Only this," Moreau said. "If any envelope marked with the initial C has been placed in your care, whether by prudence, panic, or beneficence, give it to me. It may save your household a very public education in cruelty." Valenne's gaze did not flicker. He possessed the courtroom habit of making stillness a weapon. "You imply that my house harbors evidence in a matter of death." "I imply nothing," Moreau said. "I ask. Rumor does the implying. It is already speaking in the streets. Hear how loudly it speaks when it is not contradicted." A faint movement at the doorway made them turn. Madame Valenne had crossed the threshold silently, the lamplight sketching pale gold at her temples. She looked first at her husband, then at Moreau, as if measuring which man required more mercy to be told the truth. "We do not have your envelope, Inspector," she said, "and if we had, I would have burned it." Valenne's mouth tightened. Not surprise, offence at not having been consulted by a hypothetical. "My wife is loyal," he said. "Sometimes to those who deserve it least." "Loyalty," Moreau said softly, "is not a doctrine the law interprets well." She lifted her head with a composure that seemed learned, not inherited. "You will discover, Inspector, that there are things the law does not interpret at all." He inclined his head. "Then allow me to ask a question the law is permitted. Did the deceased ever come here after his return to Paris?" "No," Valenne said before she could answer. "And if he had, he would have discovered that this house does not accept uninvited guests. Madame Valenne closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, the ocean in them had learned a new shore. "He wrote," she said. "He asked for forgiveness and for nothing else. I sent him none, and I still have nothing to give you, Inspector, except a request. End this kindly." Kindly. The word did not often find the prefecture. Moreau rose. "I will end it truthfully. Kindness, if we are fortunate, will resemble that." They returned to the street where the fog had grown thick with evening. It pressed close, friendly as a lie told to spare a friend. On a corner, a paperboy was shouting the second editions. Lucas bought one and showed the lower column to his chief. Someone had supplied a new rumor. The nameless man had been seen alive 2 days after his reported death, drinking in Belleville with a woman whose hair was described with improbable fervor. The story, flimsy as tissue, sounded almost plausible because the city wanted it to be. The dead, like debts, were easier to bear if declared imaginary. Moreau folded the page carefully, as a man folds a shirt he intends to give away. "When the press begins to resurrect a corpse," he said, "someone is preparing a burial of a different kind." "Whose?" Lucas asked. "Whichever truth cannot survive daylight," Moreau said. "We will not find it in editorials or drawing rooms. We will find it where the envelope should have waited and did not, between a cafe stove and a bridge, in the hands of someone who knew what fire was for." A gust rattled the lamplight, and the river answered with its patient breath. Moreau felt the city lean closer, eavesdropping on its own conscience. Somewhere a printing press hammered its iron heart. Somewhere a clerk sealed a letter that would arrive too late. The inspector turned toward Montmartre again, to the small hotel where a door had been locked and a life unlocked in silence. He did not believe the city's new story. He believed the pale dust beneath a dead man's nail and the ring print on a cheap bedside table, marks that had never learned to lie. As he reached the foot of the hill, a messenger brushed past and thrust a folded paper into his hand. It bore no seal, only a short line written in that modest, treacherous hand. "You seek the envelope. Seek instead the woman who refused it." He stood beneath the gas lamp, the note warming in his palm like the breath of an argument he had half expected to lose. The city's voice, multiplied by presses, told one kind of truth. But this was the smaller voice, the one that survived between sentences. He looked up toward the ragged row of windows where strangers lived unobserved lives and knew where the night would take him next. Night had settled over Montmartre, folded into the seams of its crooked alleys and stone staircases. The gaslights flickered in long vertical columns, their reflections bending through rain puddles like liquid amber. Inspector Moreau walked upward, past the silent boulangerie with its shuttered glass, past the sleeping cats on window ledges, past doorways that had seen too many stories woven and unwoven. The hill was quiet at this hour, but not still. Murmurs lived behind the walls. Secrets breathed under floorboards. Somewhere there was a woman waiting who had refused an envelope, and with it, perhaps, a truth unbearable to speak. Her name was Clémence de Villers. The note had been plain, unadorned: "Seek instead the woman who refused it." No address, but Moreau knew the world well enough to understand how doors opened when one asked in the right tone at the right time. She lived in a boarding house on Rue Lamarck, a place where half the tenants were women alone, and the other half were men pretending not to be so. The landlady gave him a tight smile when he showed his credentials, then pointed to a thin door at the end of the hall. "Madame de Villers?" the inspector asked, through the wood. There was a pause. Then the sound of a bolt being drawn back. The door opened slightly. She was younger than he had imagined, not more than 30, though her eyes had lived longer. Her hair was dark, drawn into a simple knot at the base of her neck. There were no rings on her fingers, no signs of wealth. But she had a face that bore an untended light, the kind that burned quietly from within. "Inspector," she said softly, "I thought you would come." "Then you knew someone would tell me." She stepped back, allowing him in. The room was small but neat, with a single oil lamp beside a modest writing desk. On the wall hung a framed charcoal sketch of a riverbank, no artist's name, but a memory preserved. The bed was narrow, tidy. A trunk sat at its base, locked. "May I sit?" Moreau asked. She nodded. "Forgive the room. When one has little to hide, one has little to decorate." He studied her for a moment. "You knew Henri Lefebvre." It wasn't a question, and she did not deny it. "I knew a man who called himself Henri," she replied. "I knew the way he wrote letters and never posted them. I knew the way he looked at the world as if it had already judged him." "You knew he died." "I read it in the paper," she said. "The way others do. It is strange how death becomes real once it's printed." "And yet," Moreau said, "you refused what he left for you." She looked toward the window, where rain drew faint veins against the glass. "I refused the envelope," she corrected, "not the man." "What was in it?" She hesitated. "Words. His apology. His truth, perhaps. But truths have weight, Inspector. And some of us cannot carry what another has dropped." He drew the ring from his pocket and placed it on the desk. "Do you recognize this?" Her breath caught, but she did not touch it. "He asked me to take it back. I would not. It was not mine to keep. He wore it until the last day, because he needed something firm to hold, something that proved there had been a moment when life was not all consequence." She closed her eyes briefly. "He asked me once if a man could forgive himself for being weak. I didn't know the answer. I still don't." A silence unfolded between them, quiet but not peaceful. "Madame Devillers," Moreau said, "there is more than one truth in this case. There is the truth of the courts, the truth of rumor, the truth of the dead, and the truth that only the living know, but they rarely say it. What is it you want from me, Inspector?" He studied her face, the fine lines of sorrow that contradicted her youth. "I want to know before the city decides for us. Who was Henri Lefebvre to you?" She looked up, and the effort it took seemed like a confession in itself. "He was a man undone by honor," she said. "He worked in a shipping office in Orléans. Money went missing. Not enough to ruin an empire, but enough to ruin a man. He took the blame for someone else, a man who had children, a man he admired. Henri said the world was too hard for men who lost everything, so he gave him something to hold on to. And you?" "I met him after. He came to Paris to build a life again. We were not meant to love. There were letters, but no promises. Only the knowledge that he was a good man doing a terrible job of living with himself." "And Madame Valenne?" Clémence's voice lowered. She was the one he could not let go of, or perhaps the one he thought he deserved least. "I do not blame her. We do not choose which roles we are handed in the tragedies of others." Moreau lit his pipe, the flame trembling, as though it understood something too human to name. "There was an envelope," Clémence continued, "sealed and addressed in his hand. He gave it to me the day before he left. I was to burn it if he did not return." "And did you?" "No," she said quietly. "I could not. It is there, in the trunk." She moved to the foot of the bed, knelt, and unlocked the small brass latch. From inside, she lifted an envelope, its paper yellowed slightly at the edges. It bore the simple initial C. She handed it to Moreau. "I do not know what it holds," she said. "I never opened it. There are burdens one cannot accept even from the dead." The inspector regarded the envelope, turning it once between his fingers. The seal was unbroken. "And now?" she asked. He looked at her, at the honesty in her stillness, the ache she had practiced hiding. "Now," he said softly, "I will read it, And if there is anything here that protects your life more than it hurts it, I will bury it myself." She gave a small, tired nod. "But tell me," Moreau added gently, "why did you keep it if you meant only to refuse it?" Clémence de Villers smiled then, a smile not of joy, but of memory. "Because sometimes," she said, "the only way to honor love is not to possess it, but not to destroy its last voice either." Moreau rose. The inspector placed the envelope inside his coat, next to the photograph and the ring, holding them all like a final confession, waiting for its time. He walked toward the door. "Will you tell the world what he was?" she asked. He paused in the doorway, and when he turned, his voice was quiet enough for the walls to keep forever. "I will tell the world the only thing a story like this can still afford, that he suffered, and that suffering made him human. The rest will belong to the river." He left her standing there in the little room, her hands motionless at her sides, a ghost of a smile still lingering beneath the weight she had chosen not to carry. Outside, the rain had eased, but not stopped. It tapped on the rooftops like hesitant applause. Moreau lit his pipe and drew a slow breath, letting the smoke wrap him in its silent counsel. He walked back down the hill, his steps steady on the slick cobblestones, the envelope pressing gently against his chest like the heartbeat of another man who had run out of his own. He knew now what must be done. And he knew, too, that the truth, like the dead, never really left Paris. Paris was a city made of endings, streets that trailed into riverbanks, conversations broken by the turn of a corner, lamplight swallowed by the morning's first haze. Yet some endings resisted conclusion, like a candle flame that refuses to gutter even after the room has grown cold. Inspector Moreau knew this well. He had learned it over years of cases, none of them simple, most of them unkind. By the time he reached the Quai des Orfèvres, dawn was already creeping across the horizon, turning the fog from ash to silver. He entered his office with a silence that seemed earned. The envelope marked C lay in his coat, now slightly softened by the warmth of his body. He placed it on the desk, alongside the ring and the photograph. Ghosts of a story, arranged in a line. He waited for a moment, waited for hesitation. None came. With deliberate care, he broke the seal. The letter was brief, written in the same hand that had traced the last words of a man before the end. The paper smelled faintly of tobacco, that old companion of regret. Moreau read it once, then again, slower. Each word planted itself like a stone. "My dearest C, by the time this reaches you, what remains of me will no longer matter, not to the world, and not to you. I write not to ask forgiveness, nor to claim innocence, for both are lies that do not stand in the light. Believe this only, the sin was not mine alone, yet I bore it as though it were. I did so by choice. A man should sometimes choose the burden that spares another. I loved you as I could, flawed and quiet, and that is the truth I am least ashamed of. If the ring still rests where I left it, then let it stay. I wore it not as a promise of marriage we never made, but as a reminder of the one thing I did not lose. Do not come after me. Do not soften the world's judgment. Let the world be cruel. It is kinder that way. H.L." Moreau folded the letter again and stared at the edges where the fibers had begun to fray. The confession was not a disclosure of crime, nor a plea for absolution. It was something simpler, a man's final refusal to let the truth burden the woman who might have carried it. A truth too bare to be called scandal, too human to be called justice. He turned to the window. Beyond the glass, the Seine flowed with its usual indifference, as though every secret ever whispered to it lay flattened beneath its rippling surface. In the pale light, the river looked neither sad nor forgiving, merely eternal. Lucas entered quietly, carrying the morning's reports. "Inspector," he said, "the press is already chasing shadows." Two papers now claim the dead man was a spy. Another says he was seen in Vienna last Christmas. Moreau nodded. Let them talk. The city always needs a ghost to lean on. Lucas hesitated. And the envelope? The inspector placed his hand over it. It's nothing that belongs to the prefecture, or the courts, or the press. He drew a breath. It belongs to silence. Lucas understood. A silence not of concealment, but of mercy. A kind that the law didn't comprehend, but humanity sometimes required. The younger man nodded once, then backed toward the door. Sir, he said quietly, there's a woman waiting downstairs. She said she knew Henri Lefebvre, wouldn't give her name. Moreau didn't react. Send her up. He put the letter back into his coat as though tucking in the last breath of a vanished life. Moments later, the door opened. Madame Valenne stepped in, more composed than she had been before, but still shadowed. She closed the door behind her with care. Inspector, she said, you have read it. Yes. She stood where she was, her chin lifted slightly, as if tenderness itself had become too heavy to carry in the room. Was there anything of me in it? She asked. No. He shook his head gently. Only of himself. And of her, she said, not as a question. A statement resigned to the truth. Yes, Moreau replied. She inhaled slowly. Henri once told me that Paris was not a place but a habit of leaving without leaving, forgetting without forgetting. She gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. He was right. You came to ask if you are mentioned, Moreau said softly. But you already knew he would not mention you. She didn't deny it. He loved us differently, she said. I out of memory. She out of hope. The inspector stepped closer. The story ends here, madame. While it is still a story and not a headline. There was a pause. Thank you, Inspector, she said. He watched her leave, her quiet footsteps slipping down the corridor without echo, like a woman who had long ago learned how to disappear without vanishing. Alone again, Moreau gathered the ring, the photograph, and the letter. He placed them in a small envelope of his own and sealed it, not with wax, but with caution. He rose, took his coat, and walked down the stairs, out onto the quay, where the first pale cut of sunlight was breaking through a sky still bruised by night. The Seine was breathing lightly now, its movement steady and unjudging. He walked to the Pont Saint-Michel and leaned over, holding the envelope between two fingers. For a moment, the world was still, just the inspector, the river, and the faint hum of the waking city. Then, with a motion no more dramatic than a sigh, he released it. The envelope fluttered, caught a breath of wind, then fell, light as a memory, into the slow current below. It drifted until the paper darkened, then sank without ripple. For a long time, Moreau watched the spot where it vanished. Some truths are not for the record. Some names are meant to fade. He turned, lit his pipe, and walked along the quay with his hands in his pockets, and the city beginning its day around him, a city full of people with names and lives, and the quiet fear that one day they too might be forgotten. He breathed deep the familiar scent of Paris, rain on stone, smoke from chimneys, the faint trace of bread warming in a bakery he could not yet see. Another case would come, it always did, but for now the man who hid his name had found his last disguise. And Inspector Moreau, as always, walked on.